today than I normally do. It's normally been my practice to preach on the gospel, and I always find good news to be found in the good news. But I'd like to preach on the Old Testament lesson this morning, and I think if I look hard enough, and I think over the last couple of weeks I did look hard enough, and I think I found some good news in the Old Testament reading. So I'd like to share that with you this morning. And the reading, as you know, comes from Genesis. And I want to say, to start off, I want to say a few things about Genesis, just to kind of put it into a context for you. Genesis is the first of 5 books of the Old Testament, called the Torah, called the Pentateuch, 5 being Pentateuch, and it's stories of beginnings. And so it starts with the beginning of the world. Could I suggest to you that the beginning, the first 2 chapters of Genesis, was not written first, that it was written somewhat later and put at the beginning? But that's for another time. If you were to look at Genesis, scholars break it down in very, very many ways. But most of them agree that the last 4 sections of Genesis, from about chapter 12 on, are about 4 of the beginning stories of the great members of a family that created the nation Israel. We call those members patriarchs. Sorry, ladies, they were men, not women. And that's just the way it is. So it's 4 important men who were chosen to be the beginnings of the nation Israel. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And it goes from Genesis 12 through to Genesis 50. There are 50 chapters in the book of Genesis. There are 1,533 verses. And in our common lectionary in the Anglican Church, we read 31 readings from Genesis over the 3 years. Year A has the most, 16 readings. Year B has the least, 5, and year C has 7. There is 1 reading that is read every year, A, B, and C. And that's during the Easter Vigil, the night before Easter Day. So, what have we got to say about this? Well, from June the 4th right the way through to August the 20th, there are 12 readings from Genesis in this year A. They're sequential. When I mean sequential, they come in order. They don't join up with one another. It's like skipping a rock across a pond. We bounce them over for 12 weeks. And I'm sorry, it's just highlights. If you're in church every Sunday from June the 4th until August the 15th, you will hear highlights of these 4 patriarchs. And we have a highlight today. It's a great highlight. It's a story of the rogue of the Old Testament. This man, Jacob, was, well, he was devoid of any moral conscience. But let me say right from the beginning, he was human as you and I are human. And it seems to me that if God can call this rogue into a relationship with him, then we all have an opportunity to be called into a relationship with God. And if you don't go home with anything else, go home with that idea that you and I can be called into a relationship with God because God cares for us humans. Now, to put it a little further into context, Jacob was a twin. He was the younger twin, born just a few minutes after his brother. His brother was another nation. According to the Bible, 2 nations vied for attention within the birth struggle when Esau and Jacob were born. But Jacob was going to be the one that was going to use all the trickery, all the cunning, and all the difficulty to get what he wanted. He wasn't a religious man. He was going to get what he wanted by any way, shape, or form. And ultimately what he did is he bought the birthright from his brother Esau. We read that last week in our story from Genesis. And what we missed out was between then and our reading here, he stole the blessing from his father that was assigned to Esau. He dressed up and he went in and took the blessing away from Esau. And Esau was so annoyed and so upset that he set out to kill him, so that Jacob needed to get out of there. And the Bible tells us that they concocted a story to give reason. But even the story is suspect. The story is that he needed to go back to his homeland to find a wife. And so he's running away, frightened, and he comes to this place. Now, the translation suggests that this place is a special place even before the dream and Jacob wakes up. That it's a special place where, let me put it this way. Have you ever had an experience where you go to a special place and you know that this place is special? You feel it. The first time I was ever on the property of Sorrento Center, I drove into that place. It was raining like cats and dogs. We were lost. We didn't know exactly where we were going. We were winding our way through what looked like forest. And yet, when we woke up the next day and found ourselves in Sorrento, there was this sense that Sorrento was a special place. And that's what I believe Jacob experienced when he came to this place. He was running away. He was full of fear. He was lonely. He was in fear of his life. He really needed God. If there's anything Jacob needed, he needed the appearance of God. And yet he didn't even think about that. And he lay down and went to sleep. Now, the Bible has a way of telling us when God wants to knock on your door. And it usually happens in a dream. So it was that Jacob had a dream. And in this dream, he saw a ladder. Let me suggest to you, it's not like a ladder that we call a ladder to lean up against the wall. I would suggest to you it's more like a ramp of stairs. If you have ever been to Mexico, to these wonderful cities in the jungle, you'll know the kind of thing I'm talking about. It kind of goes up a great tower and these stairs kind of go all the way up. And that's what I suggest to you. The reason I suggest that, because there's a phrase in here that says that this ladder was attached to the earth and went all the way up to the very top of heaven. The phrase used is the same phrase they use when they're talking about building the Tower of Babel. That we were going to build this tower and it's going to go all the way up and it's going to touch heaven. And that's what Jacob was dreaming of. And in that dream, God said something to Jacob. He said to Jacob, I made a promise to your grandfather. I made a promise to your father. And I'm going to make the same promise to you. Promises are always to be fulfilled in the future. It's a promise. It's something that's going to happen. So what was the promise that God made to Abraham? It consists of three things. First, you will have a land, a place to belong, where you can be who you are and live out your life as you will. Second, you will have a family. You will have a seed that will go on and on and on. And all If you don't believe me, just look up to heaven and see the stars, or look down to the ground and see the grains of sand. That is how large your family will be. And third, you will be a blessing for all nations. Those are promises. And he came to Isaac and made the same promise to Isaac. And he's now coming to Jacob and making the same promise to Jacob. But he adds two more promises to the three already there. He says, I will be with you. I will protect you. I will go with you, and I will bring you back to this place again. And the last one is that I promise that everything I promised will happen. It will come to be. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, let me suggest to you that when God promises, God fulfills his promise. When God promises, God fulfills his promise. If God says, I will be with you, God will be with you. And in that process, Jacob wakes up and he's just had a confrontation with God. I'd like to also suggest that you and I can have an encounter with God at any time. Sometimes we know we're having an encounter, and other times, like Jacob, we wake up and say, oh, I didn't realize God was with me. And I can tell you from my own experience that I backed into God much more than I walked towards him in my own ministry. And I've had people say to me, and I go, oh, I never realized. It's that kind of way with God. When God promises, God fulfills. And the Old Testament is a series of promises and fulfillment. But ultimately, we Christians understand that most of the promises of the Old Testament are fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And I think that's a significant and important part to remember. Now, what was it that Jacob understood? He woke up and he said, how awesome is this place? If you go to the King James Version of the Bible, the word awesome is replaced with fearful. How fearful is this place? In the sense that fear is awe. So fearful and awesome have the same translation. It is the presence of God overwhelming us in its simplicity and in its magnificence. Jacob was overwhelmed by the presence of God. And he came to that kind of warm fuzzies, I suspect, or like Wesley said that my heart was strangely warmed when he encountered God. And I think that's true for Jacob, and I think it's also true for us. But let me finish by putting it into the context of the Christian understanding. If these things are fulfilled in the future, and if these things are fulfilled in Jesus Christ, how is it these are fulfilled in our lives? Let me suggest to you, one, that when Jacob woke up, he realized the presence of God was with him. What do we read at Christmas time? And a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So if God was with Jacob, God is with us. Now, if God promised to Jacob a land, a place, what has he promised for us? I would like to suggest to you that the Christian community, no matter where it is and no matter what form it takes, and it doesn't matter what denomination it is, the Christian community, the worldwide association of Christians all over the world, when they gather in places such as this, is a place where you belong and where you can be who you are called to be and do what you are called to do. That you have a family. The seed will go on forever and ever, says God to Jacob. And I'm suggesting to you that through our baptism we are all children of God, and you are part of a large and ever-growing family. And the final, you will be a blessing to all nations. I see the Christian church and the Christian message as being a message that is a blessing for all, no matter where. But there's a challenge. And the challenge is for us to live up to that high calling. You know, if the world is to become Christian, it has to become Christian because people see how God moves through the Christian church. We got a long way to go. We're not there yet. Or as my mother-in-law used to say, you ain't in heaven yet. So we got a long way to go. And I think that, in my estimation, is the good news from our reading today. Let us pray. Be silent, still, aware, for deep in our own heart the Spirit is at prayer. Listen and learn, open and find, heart, wisdom, Christ. Amen.